For the lecture on the conservation movement, we're going to go back to the 1800s and the early 1900s to look at the early environmental movements. And we're going to focus on two areas. We're going to look at developments within Europe and also the New World, by which I mean mostly colonies or former colonies of Britain, such as Canada, Australia, the US, South Africa as well. So there are two themes, and one is the creation of national parks, and the second is the protection of birds, animals, and wildlife, what we might call nature protection or species protection. So why create national parks? Some people argue that the creation of national parks was really a reaction to early industrialization and some of the problems that we've seen in urban environments, and that living in these crowded, fetid cities was a recipe for all sorts of kind of ailments and nervous conditions. So living in these big polluted cities with polluted air, polluted water created these nervous conditions, and so people sought relief in nature from the nervous stresses of the city. The idea that wilderness had a kind of a calming effect and people wanted the peace and quiet of nature. So one of the other possibilities that we might explore too is the idea, particularly for areas of the New World, of national identity through the creation of national parks. And the idea that in the New World there were these natural monuments or monuments of nature. So we'll come back to some of those ideas in a minute. So the national park story for the US really begins with this California sequoia tree that in 1853 to 1854 was stripped of its bark for exhibition at Crystal Palace in London. They had these big, huge kind of world expos. In order to showcase America to the world, they brought in the bark of this fabulous tree. And on the left-hand side here, we can see description of the mammoth tree from California. And you could go and visit it for a mere sixpence. So at the bottom, it explained the scale, the sense of the scale of the tree. And so the whole height of the tree was 363 feet. The height to the first limb was 140 feet. This is all, of course, in imperial measurements. The diameter at the base was 31 feet. But just look at the size of these guys at the bottom here. And the bark at the base was 18 inches thick, so 1.5 feet thick, just the bark. They took the bark off this tree to the height of about 100 feet. So you can even see on the right-hand side how they stripped the bark in lines. So this was really a way of showcasing America to the world, and it was a very destructive short-term way because the bark was simply burnt after the exhibition. And really there was so much controversy about the removal of this sequoia tree from California in 1853 to display in the Crystal Palace that some historians argue it brought about the conservation movement, which created the national parks in the USA. This wasn't the only mammoth tree that was felled for display, and this was a tree that was 1,244 years old. It was so large that they could have dances and tea parties. The bark for this tree was sent to Broadway to be displayed in New York City, and it was the way of beginning to promote tourism. This is the 1850s. Even to Americans in the East, they weren't familiar with these huge groves of giant trees. And these forests of giant sequoias and redwoods became a symbol of U.S. wilderness. And one of the things that you might notice is this print was printed in 1862. This is actually 10 years after the tree was felled. And one of the reasons was to raise awareness about the cutting down of these magnificent trees. In the New World, in places like America or Canada or New Zealand, which also has its own beautiful kauri trees that have these mammoth trunks as well. These areas didn't really have a written human history in the way that Europe had been civilized. They didn't have that kind of spectacular architecture of cathedrals or colosseums. So these trees and the scale of these trees in the New world, and other natural features in the West become these natural monuments or monuments of nature, and they come to represent the unspoiled wilderness of the parts of the New World that had not yet been touched by European colonization. And note that I say European, because of course indigenous peoples had lived and shaped these lands, but not as much as the European civilization and the European settlers threatened to do. Okay, remember we have a whole different concept of property and very different concepts of attitudes to nature. By 1864, a senator, John Conness, had introduced the Yosemite Grant in Congress, and President Abraham Lincoln signed it. So Yosemite Valley and the Mariposa Grove were given to the state of California to be administered. So in 1866, Galen Clark became essentially what would be called the first California State Park Ranger. He was the warden of Yosemite Valley, and this is him here in his little cabin at the base of the tree that had an 85-foot circumference. So look at the scale of the man at this base of this fabulous, fabulous tree. So the U.S. is the first nation to establish a national park. If we go back for a minute here, Yosemite was a state park. The first national park in the world was also in the U.S. and created in 1872, and it's partly as a result of these same lobbyists working in the west of the United States to send an artist in the summer of 1871 named Thomas Moran to paint the beautiful sights of Yellowstone and to help convince the U.S. Congress to create a national park. So in the summer of 1871, Thomas Moran, the artist, and the photographer William Henry Jackson joined the U.S. Geological Survey of the territories, and their job on this scientific expedition was to sketch and photograph lands along the Yellowstone River in northwestern Wyoming and southeastern Montana. So Moran took detailed notes and made numerous sketches of beautiful evergreen mountain peaks and waterfalls and painted the tremendous colors. So here we see the amazing, amazing colors. His paintings were so well liked by Congress that they actually purchased two of them to hang in the Capitol building in the U.S. And so they passed legislation the following year in March of 1872 to create the first national park. And you think about this, there's no such thing as color photography. So I'm going to show you the very early photographs. And remember, photography is still a new medium in the 1870s. And some of the very first early photographs, we think of those stiff people in photos and portraits. But lots of people really wanted pictures of amazing places around the world. But of course, they're not in color. That might help convince a politician to save this place. The lithographs of Moran's paintings from this expedition, lithographs are prints that you can make fairly cheaply, help to publicize Yellowstone to people in New York and Boston and places like that. While Jackson's photos quickly really become sort of very influential in showing the western landscape of the U.S. and its natural wonders. So let's turn to Australia. Australia created the second national park in the world in 1879. And the reasons really are a bit more akin to the creation of urban parks, like Central Park in New York City or the Bois de Boulogne in Paris that we talked about when we looked at public health and sanitation. The idea was this need for an escape from the city. Australia National Park was built about 35 kilometers from Sydney, and a railway was built directly from the city centre and the suburbs all the way to the park, because of course people didn't have cars. So these national parks then sprang from concerns about public health prompted by overcrowded and unsanitary conditions of large industrial cities. A letter to the editor on the 24th of April 1879 reported the founding of Australia National Park as thus: "The toil-worn citizen will be able to recreate himself amid scenes of natural beauty and grandeur." So the idea of the Australia National Park is not necessarily about conservation, but it's about sport and recreation. Although it was not an urban park, it's definitely influenced by the climate of public opinion about the need for green spaces and nature near the cities. So John Muir is the founder of the Sierra Club, a conservation organization. They are early environmental activists. So really John Muir fought to preserve watersheds, river basins, prevent the damming of rivers, prevent the logging in the parks. He didn't win all of the battles for sure. So if we think about his philosophy, he suggests thousands of tired, nerve-shaken, over-civilized people are beginning to find out going to the mountains is going home, that wilderness is a necessity, and that mountain parks and reservations are useful not only as fountains of timber and irrigating rivers, but as fountains of life. Now, John Muir had this incredible opportunity to camp out under the stars with President Theodore Roosevelt in Yosemite Park in 1903. They actually camped out for several evenings. Here they are visiting the grizzly giant tree, which was 2,700 years old. And this is chronicled in Ken Burns' National Park series. This is Theodore Roosevelt, and here is John Muir. So in May of 1903, President Roosevelt came to Yosemite to have Muir show him the valley and its forests, and they camped one night under the big trees, and they rode horses high above the Yosemite floor and camped out 2 more nights. And Roosevelt's impression was lying out at night under those giant sequoias was lying in a temple built by no hand of man, a temple grander than any human architect could by any possibility build, and I hope for the preservation of the groves of giant trees, simply because it would be a shame to our civilization to let them disappear. They are monuments in themselves. So Canada was the 3rd nation to found a national park. And really, Canada had only just been founded itself. If we think of Confederation, 1867, it was a nation that wasn't even 20 years old. The first nation-building project, if you remember your Canadian history, was the building of the railways to connect those potential western provinces and western territories, later that became provinces of BC and Alberta, to central Canada by railway, and they actually hired Chinese workers to do so. And it was some of these railway workers who discovered the hot springs at Banff in 1883. And it was the Canadian Pacific Railway that built the hotels for tourists and convinced the Canadian government to set aside these lands. Early initiatives of national parks in Canada are really about tourism. But of course, these were the picture postcards that people sent around the world, such as this 1910 souvenir of the Canadian Rockies. A similar story can be told about South Africa. The first game reserve in Africa was the Sable Game Reserve in 1898, which would later become Kruger National Park, which still exists. Initial reason for Kruger National Park was tourism of a kind that involved big game hunting. The animal populations among herbivores had already been decimated because there had been the Anglo-Boer War and an illness among large numbers of wildlife. There were still many carnivores, but not as many herbivores. Before the end of the term of office of James Stevenson Hamilton, who was the park warden of the Sable Game Reserve, he began to turn around the policy on big game hunting, realize the attraction of those big game for tourists, the idea of safari without guns. And you see slowly in the first decades of the 1900s a change of policy, so that by the time of the founding of Kruger National Park in 1926, the slogan here on the very bottom of this advertisement in the Illustrated London News says, "Camping out in the game reserve and shooting the animals by camera are thrilling pastimes. A wonderful sight in the Kruger National Park, zebra, buck, and other wild game in the natural state under government protection." So instead of promoting hunting, they began to promote nature protection and to try to prevent poaching. And so here you see, even at the top, the Great South African Game Reserve herds of protected wild animals in the Kruger National Park. So if we look at the conservation movement in the New World, it begins in 1864 with Yosemite, the first state park in California, which becomes a national park in 1890. The first Imperial Conference on African Wildlife was actually held in London in the UK, top-down type of approach. And Canada was the first nation to establish a national park service. If we compare the conservation movement in Europe, we see that the timeline is very much shifted. Europeans lived in a landscape cultivated, deforested, urbanized for centuries. So there's a very different approach, and that is one of non-interference or scientific observation. So the Swedes established their 9 national parks all at once, 100,000 square kilometers of species and nature protected areas. So the Swiss are the first to come in 1914, and they're really a conservation activist group of scientists pressuring the government to create a protected area. And what they want is an area that's untouched. The philosophy is let nature evolve on its own, untouched by human hands. And the idea was to ensure that a piece of Switzerland's mountain landscape be left to develop entirely naturally, and any changes should be the subject of scientific observation and research. So if you see here, this same vista, this same view taken in a photograph, shows how they have left this landscape untouched, and they've just celebrated their 100th anniversary in 2014. And here you can see some of this idea of it being untouched or without interference. The Germans had the same type of philosophy, with a little bit more of an emphasis on German heritage. The idea that the land, German land, is part of its heritage. So they really create these German nature conservation areas. In the 1920s, there's an uneasy alliance of the green and the brown. The brown shirts are the Nazis, and that there's a sometimes uncomfortable association of German heritage with Nazism. So there is, however, a different set of emphases responding to different realities. There are old civilizations in Europe, while the new worlds in the colonies are unspoiled. So let's turn from land and ecosystems or wilderness to the protection of birds, animals, and wildlife as a form of early environmental activism. Let's look at species protection. And this movement really begins in the Americas with John Audubon, who's actually French. And John Audubon drew in the 1820s and 1830s many types of birds. So you can still buy the Audubon Field Guide to Birds, which is a variation of his Birds of America. Note the gun. He often gathered his information from hunters. He would weigh the birds after he shot them, or get a specimen from a fellow hunter. He would note the color of the feathers and the bird calls or bird song that he heard while hunting, and he would also count the numbers of sightings in an area. This is his snowy heron or white egret, which is going to become an important bird needing conservation. So the first society for the protection of birds in the Americas was the Audubon Society, founded in Boston in 1886, and this is one of Audubon's paintings, beautiful paintings of red-breasted merganser. And there's a very strong association of conservation with hunting. This might be kind of ironic for us. Many magazines like Forest and Stream, which feature here this hunter and his hunting dog ready to go and grab any bird that he's shot down, would reproduce the plates by these lovely painted plates by Audubon. This is published all in the late 1890s and into the early 1900s. At this time, in both Europe and North America, it was the fashion to wear feathers At the turn of the century, stylish women wore hats, this is really before the First World War, with the latest feather-top designs from Paris, New York, and other centers of fashion. Millinery houses in Europe and America traded internationally and indiscriminately for birds, so the more exotic or unique the hat design and feather display, the larger the sales. Women were wearing whole bodies of birds on hats and clothing.
For centuries, the nation's greatest breeding ground for its most beautiful plumed birds was southern Florida, where the fresh waters of Lake Okeechobee drained slowly toward the Gulf of Mexico, through cypress swamps and mangrove forests, and the biggest sawgrass marsh in the world, the Everglades. But by 1900, the long plumes of the great white and snowy egrets had become more valuable per ounce than gold, and nearly 95% of Florida's shorebirds had been killed by plume hunters. More than 5 million birds a year were perishing to satisfy the demand of the latest fashion trend, using bird feathers to decorate women's hats. Strolling the streets of New York for part of an afternoon, one ornithologist counted 542 feathered hats, representing 40 different species. Some hats included an entire stuffed bird.
You begin to get a series of laws or acts, the 1901 Audubon Law or the Lacey Act, which prohibits the transport across state lines of these birds that were shot, in this case, on this image, by poachers. These bird societies, and you see here none of these ladies in this picture are wearing feathers on their caps, are something that you have on both sides of the Atlantic. So across in Europe, there's a similar story of the creation of the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds. This was a society mainly, actually, for the most part, created by women to put pressure on other women not to wear these kinds of hats. And this is also true in Germany, where you have what is now called the Nature and Biodiversity Conservation Union, or NABU. Today, this German Conservation Union has more members. It has about 10 times as many members as the Green Party does. If we think about bird life or bird migration, birds are international creatures, and so you begin to have a movement that becomes more international, such as in the 1913 Migratory Bird Act that outlawed market hunting and interstate transport of birds. You begin to have cooperation between states, such as the US and Canada, in a place like Point Pelee. This was one of our earliest national parks in 1909, where you have a bird sanctuary right on the Canada-US border. And in Europe, too, it's part of the development of the European Union. These organizations become international. And that's really our next story, is how the environmental movement becomes internationally, how we come up with this idea of think globally, act locally.